The footage you're about to watch about the day leading up to the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is going to be shocking, terrifying, horrific, and it's going to downright make you angry. But most important of all, it's going to put you in deep thought.
What we learned is not known anywhere, except in a few groups that I go to speak to. In the course of it, however, the course of that investigation, I had to move my first family to England because my 4-year-old son took a telephone call which threatened his father's life. And I said, this is no way for a kid to be raised. So I moved the family to England, and I was a visiting scholar at Cambridge, and they were all raised in Cambridge. But I commuted from England back and forth. They were safe, and I did what I thought I had to do to get to the bottom of this case. Martin Luther King was shot on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. That's history. His room was number 306. His room originally had been 202, a secure room, down on the ground floor.
Important detail to remember. The original room was 202, new room 306, moved from the first floor to the second floor.
At Holloman's instructions from his older brother, which said, you've got to move King to 306 or 308, one of the balcony rooms, because he's in too secure a place. So get OZ, who was an employee of the Adkins family, get OZ to go to Jackson and arrange for the change of rooms. So OZ Evers was called. Little Ronnie brought the phone book in from the outhouse, and she called OZ. OZ went to Reverend Jackson, gave him his instructions. Jackson went to Bailey, who owned the motel, but Bailey told his wife, Lurleen, to make the change. As an aside, after Martin King was shot, she screamed, oh my God, what have I done? She ran to her room and locked the door and ended up with a cerebral hemorrhage and died in the hospital 5 days later. She knew what had happened, what she had done. So the room was changed, and there was a group there called the Invaders. They were a Black Panther group. They were working with Dr. King on the march, and there was a knock on their door at about 20 to 6, and they were told they had to leave by a motel staff person. And one of them, I interviewed every one of the invaders one by one at length. One of them said, but why do we have to leave? It was almost 6 o'clock, the day was over in terms of rent. We're working with Dr. King, we're getting the march ready. Who's now telling us to leave? And the hotel staff person said, Reverend Jackson. He's been paying the bills for SCLC. So they got rid of the invaders who were in 2 rooms and who were armed and could possibly have caused the problem.
Another important detail. The invaders, members of the Black Panther Party there to protect Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., were removed from the hotel by Reverend Jesse Jackson.
And one of the names was Reverend Samuel Billy Kyles. And the group was to have barbecue dinner at Kyle's home that evening, and Kyles was instructed to get Martin King out of his room on the balcony at 6 o'clock. That was his job. So he knocked on the door at about 10 to 6. Door was open for a few seconds, then closed, and he walked back down the balcony, north on the balcony, and put his hands on the railing and just waited. He built a career for himself by saying he was in the room with Martin King for the last half hour of his life, helping him get dressed and all that. It was a total lie. Because I had the police investigators' surveillance reports that just very categorically said what I've just told you. And he was never in the room with Dr. King. Abernathy told me he was never in the room, so that was one thing.
Important detail. Dr. King was scheduled to have dinner at Reverend Billy Cow's home. Their dinner time was moved up an hour, and it was Reverend Cow's job to have Dr. King out for photo ops at that precise time in which Dr. King was shot.
Didn't come up. I always wondered why Collins didn't come up when Dr. King came out, why he didn't come up for a photo op. But he didn't. Now I know why he didn't, because he knew what was going to happen and he didn't want to get too close to that bullet. The best shot on the Memphis police force was a man called Frank Strouser. And Frank Strouser was out at the pistol range shooting on a regular basis, and he was observed by a man called Lenny Curtis, who was a janitor. And Lenny not only told about Strouser's threats, but on the day of the killing, he remembers that Strouser was given a very special kind of rifle. And he practiced with that rifle all day, and he left at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And he was headed for no good. He was the sniper who shot Martin Luther King Jr. Now, I invited him to lunch. He's still alive, drives a taxi cab in Memphis. I invited him to lunch. I say, you have lunch with me, I'll give you $500. He needs money. So he had lunch, didn't eat, but he came to sit down at lunch. And he was very non-committal in terms of, I told him it was alleged that he was the shooter of Martin Luther King Jr. And that we had sufficient evidence to get him on this. And he denied it. He didn't have an alibi as to where he was. He hemmed and hawed about that. But then I said to him, I said, now tell me, Frank, what size are your shoes? And he's, with a little smirk on his face, he said, 13 large. And he knew why I was asking, because that was the size of the shoes of the shooter and was heading in the opposite direction. We had the plaster of Paris cast up. So we had it set up so sometime after the lunch, one of my street people, I had a lot of street people in Memphis, Tennessee, because I spent a lot of years there. One of my street people was also a taxi driver who knew Strouser for 25 years, jumped in the back of his cab and said, Frank, I hear Pepper's got enough evidence to have you indicted for the killing of King. What do you think of that? Strouser got all shook up, and he said, what are they going to get me for something I did 30 years ago or knew about? So we had that. We couldn't confront him, because Lenny Curtis, so long as Lenny Curtis was alive, I couldn't confront him because they would have killed Lenny. They knew he was the source. Strouser took him one day down to police headquarters to get some payroll checks, and on the way he took him through the woods. And he bared his gun and said, now, who do you think killed King? Do you think this guy Ray really did it? And of course Lenny said, oh yes, of course he did it. He did it. I said, yeah, well, I hope that's your real opinion, Lenny. And then another time, Lenny was opening the door to his house to go in and he started to light a cigarette, and he smelled the gas. They had turned on the gas in his house. They quickly put it out. There was an unmarked car across the street in front of his house, and frequently that unmarked car was there. And there was a V built into a tree looking down into his kitchen window. So they were intimidating, but they didn't kill. I knew if I moved too quickly, I had to wait till Lenny died. So it was, I don't know, about 4 years or so. I held on to all this information, couldn't use it. finally, Lenny died, and I was able to use it and able to confront our friend Frank Strausser. And that's what happened. But the real story is that Martin King was not killed by the bullet from Frank Strausser. He was alive, and he was taken to the emergency room of St. Joseph's Hospital. And they were working on him feverishly, trying to give him life, restore his life. And Dr. Breen Bland, who was the head of neurosurgery, came into the emergency room at one point and said, "Stop working on that nigger and let him die. Now get out of here, all of you." And he had two men in suits with him. And they threw everybody out of the room. And as Lula Mae Shelby was going out of she's a surgical nurse. As she was going out, she was the last one going out the door, and she was at the door, and she heard this sound. Caught her attention, so she turned around, and she saw the three men spit on the body of Dr. King. And then she saw Dr. Breen Bland, the neurosurgeon, take a pillow and put it over his head and face and suffocate him to death. He was still alive.
Okay, let's revisit the actions of Reverend Billy Cowell, whom Dr. King was scheduled to have dinner at, and listen to the insight of activist Dick Gregory as to what he think happened.
Found that white boy guilty of conspiring to kill Dr. Martin Luther King. And they went further than that. And they also said there was some co-conspirators, black folks, unnamed, that was involved. I want to show you a little 3-minute clip of the minister that Dr. King was going by his house for dinner. He was due at 7, but they had to move it up because 7 would be a little too dark to shoot somebody. So they moved it to 6 o'clock. 2 years ago at a press conference in Memphis, I get a call. And they said, so-and-so is thinking about killing so-and-so, so-and-so. I said, what? They said, well, he said something at a press conference. I said, put him on the phone. I said, whatever you do, get that film. Because once NBC realized what this brother had slipped and said, we will never get our hands on the film. What you're fixing to see now went into the evidence in the King trial where they brought a wrongful death suit, and I'll explain that to you quickly in a minute. But what you're fixing to witness now is the man who came by to get King to take him to dinner. And 30 years later at a press conference, he slipped because God do baffle your mind sometimes. You look,
some of the activities are geared especially for the young who did not have a chance to get the feel or to know what the civil rights movement actually was about. Even as they marched, now they could have stopped in a hotel, but when you think about marching from Memphis to Jackson or Jackson to Memphis, there were no hotels. You stayed in churches, you stayed in people's homes, and that's how we got over, that's how we got through. The struggle was a spiritual struggle. You couldn't pay people to do what we had to do. You couldn't pay people to stand before mad dogs and fire hoses and billy clubs and cattle prods. It was strictly a spiritual and moral movement. So we wanted that dimension to be in the pilgrimage to Memphis. We will revisit the mountaintop speech site. That's the Mason's Temple, where Dr. King made his last address, which he almost didn't make, because the night that we were having that rally, there were tornado warnings, and he was behind on the Poor People's Campaign. And he said, you guys go on over and have the rally. I'm going to stay at the motel and work on the Poor People's Campaign. When we got there and Dr. Abernathy walked in and Jesse Jackson walked in and I walked in and others, people started clapping because they thought Martin was behind us. And so Ralph's preacher said to him, this is not our crowd. And he went to the phone and called Dr. King. And any of the marches that we had in those days, you have an opportunity to bring the children and bring the family and march with us. And when I finished sharing with them the last hour of Dr. King's life, a hurry. But that gave me the wonderful privilege of spending the last hour on earth. 3 preachers in a room, Abernathy, King, and Kyles. And we spent that last hour together in room 306 at the Lorraine Motel. The press is always curious, and writers, what went on? What did you talk about? I say, we just talk preacher talk. What preachers talk about when they get together.
Y'all pay real attention to what you're fixing to hear now.
About 5:45, we walked on the balcony, and he was talking to people in the courtyard. He stood here and I stood there. Only as I moved away, so we could have a clear shot, the shot rang out.
Thank you.
I turned around and then knocked him back on the balcony.
Listen. Oh. Wait, listen. Listen. 30 years later, this brother never realized that he would slip and say that. Do you know what happened when you're sitting in a jury room about a conspiracy and this piece of film is introduced? He stood here, I stood here, only as I moved away so he could have a clear shot. The shot rang out. This was the brother that he was going by his house for dinner. Now, to my brother Matty, you will have a copy of this tape. I'll get it back to you. And what you should do is make copies. See to it, because this is a very valuable. And y'all need to send this tape to people all over this country. And so this was the trial that went on that the press didn't want to report because they couldn't. They couldn't. And so we have to stop getting mad and upset because the same system that's killing us refuse to tell us the truth. You have to use your own God-given intelligence. If we was all over in Germany today walking down the street and we see this big old building and it's named after Adolf Hitler, you don't have to be too smart to realize something evil is going on inside that building. But how come you don't understand that when you walk down in Washington, D.C. and see that big old brand new FBI building named after J. Edgar Hoover? How come we don't know something evil is going on inside that building? Let me briefly tell you some of the things the jury heard. The trial should have lasted a day and a half. It lasted 30 days. The black press in Memphis didn't even show up. Let me tell you how this trial came about. About 6 years ago, a white man named Lord Jarvis, who probably, now this is just my philosophy, believe, who probably was told they're fixing to blame the King murders on you. So he went to ABC, and they did a whole session with him, telling them how he was involved and what the conspiracy and who it was. And then they never ran it. And so now he's running for his life. So he goes to the King family, and he tells them the same thing that he told ABC. He tells them 3 times, and the 4th time, Andy Young. And they filmed it, they taped it. And he said, I was given $100,000 by Frank Liberto, who was the mafia puppet who ran Memphis for the big mafia boys out of New Orleans. So it was Frank Liberto, he said, that gave him $100,000 to set up the whole mechanism for killing King. In the building right behind the Lorraine Hotel with the courtyard bumped into, Lord Jarvis had a restaurant called Jim's Grill. He also said that at the first meeting, here's who was there, so-and-so was there, so-and-so was there, and let me tell you, there was some black folks there too. The black man in the very famous picture that was leaning over Martin Luther King, Merle McClellan, he was there at the first meeting.
Very important detail. The black man kneeling over Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. after he was shot was actually an FBI agent that had infiltrated the SCLC.
Not only was he an undercover cop, he was so undercover that his paycheck didn't even come from the Memphis Police Department, came from the utility company. And now tonight, as we sit here, he's a CIA agent. His other job was to infiltrate a little group of little juvenile thugs. They call themselves the Invaders. And y'all got to be careful about what y'all join just because they're yelling and screaming about whitey. Y'all got to be careful about what kind of evil, nasty black folk you get around that want to go blow up something and then wonder why you get arrested on your way there. Martin Luther King was preparing for the Poor People's March in Washington, D.C. Yet many senators and many Congress people said, we don't think he should come here because we are afraid of the amount of violence that will be created. Martin Luther King's answer to that was, I've led demonstrations, there's been violence, but it wasn't on our side. It was people attacking us. Now, if I'm going to be blamed for that, then there's something wrong. And so they decided that they would create a violent situation. And Merle McClellan, the undercover Memphis cop, had also infiltrated the Invaders. And it was when King came in for one day to lead that march. One day. To lead that march. One day. And it was their job to see to it that it broke into a ride so King could no longer say that I've never led a march that led to a ride. And that was to force him to come back for a second march so they could kill him. And so all at once, the King family decides to sue Lord Jarvis on a wrongful death suit. Not that they wanted any money, so the first time the truth could be validated and documented. So there's a lot of people upset about the Truth and Reconciliation Committee in South Africa, but 100 years from now, Because of that, 100 years from now, nobody has to say, let me tell you what those black folks say they did to them. They can't say that now because white folks came and testified under oath that this is what we did. Because of this trial, no longer will anybody be able to say, these conspirators allege this to have happened. It's documented under oath. They subpoenaed the captain who was over the fire station, which was across the street, firehouse number 2 from the Lorraine Hotel. 34 years later, he's 34 years older, 7 years old, fat, getting ready to die, wanting to find Jesus. So he came and raised his hand and told the truth. Would you give your name? Yes. How old are you? What's your occupation? I'm retired. What was it before you retired? The Memphis Farm. What was your top rank? Battalion commander. Where were you on April the 4th, 1968 when Martin Luther King was shot? Said, I was in charge of the fire station across the street from the Lorraine Hotel. Did you notice anything different that day? Yeah, early that morning, some people came and introduced themselves as Army intelligence. Said they'd like to go up on the roof and put King under surveillance. What'd you do? I led them up to the roof. What did they have with them? They had large containers, small containers. What do you think was in the containers? I don't know. What do you think? Well, it could have been stuff to take motion pictures, still pictures. Could the containers held high power rifles? Yes, they could have. And then what happened? Well, later that day when the shot rang out, they were still on the roof. So we know that the United States government not only had pictures of Martin Luther King being killed, they also had pictures of the person that did it.
It is well documented that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was under 24-hour surveillance by the FBI led by J. Edgar Hoover, up to, before, and beyond the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So listen to this evidence and tie the ends together.
Which means he had been shot from down here, not up there. He's a white man who ran the fire station, who probably 30-some years ago couldn't care if King lived or died. He's a white man sitting there saying to 6 blacks and 6 white jewelry that, yes, I saw the wound and the wound went this way. And the next one that testified that he had interviewed people from military intelligence, the 111, the 209. The 209 is so vicious, they were scared of CIA. And the 184, that's the sniper team, that's the Rangers. When they had to admit they was there, they say, well, we was there as a backup, and that leads you to believe they was talking about to back up in case the security broke down. They was there to back up in case that hit didn't hit, they were supposed to take him out. That's what the jewelry heard. Found it in Atlanta, and he found some notes in it that he said the minute he read the notes, he knew it was a conspiracy, but he called one of the numbers, this is 1968, that was on the number, and it ended up going to a nightclub in Dallas that Jack Ruby used to own, and Jack Ruby is the one who killed Lee Harvey Oswald, who was arrested for killing Kennedy. He said he got so scared he never turned it in because he thought if he turned it in and they know he looked at that, they would kill him. This is the FBI. And this is who we have to deal with every day. Those of us out here in the movement have to deal with folks who are a white FBI agent said, I didn't turn the stuff in because had I turned it in, it probably would have killed me. That's some of the things they heard at the trial. Just to set the record straight, Jeremy L. Ray never confessed to killing King. He pleaded guilty. There's a difference. If a cop grabbed me and say, I'll kill all your granddaughters if you don't say you took that purse, now, plead guilty. A confession means you have to know some of the intricate details that nobody else knows but the police who was there investigating it and the person that did it. He never confessed. This document went into the records. He had probably one of the best defense attorneys that had ever lived in the history of the planet at the time. His defense attorney was called Percy Foreman from Houston. Lawyers used to come in from all over the world and just go to this bar where he used to hang out and just sit and listen to Percy talk. He was James L. Ray's lawyer. James L. Ray was coming up to be sentenced on March the 10th. Here's the letter that Percy Foreman, James L. Ray's lawyer, sent him on March the 9th, 1969. Percy Foreman, Houston, Texas, March the 9th, 1969. Mr. James Earl Ray, Shelby County Jail, Memphis, Tennessee. Dear James Earl, you've asked that I advance to your brother Ray, Jerry Ray, $500 of the $5,000 referred to in the first $5,000 paid by William Bradford Huey on January the 29th. Mr. Huey advanced an additional $5,000 at that time. I had spent in excess of $9,500 on your case. Since then, I have spent in excess of $4,000 additional. But I am willing to advance Jerry $500 and add that to the $165,000 mentioned in my other letter to you today. In other words, I would receive the first $165,500, but I would make the advance to your brother of $500. And this advance also is in contingent upon your plea of guilty at the sentencing tomorrow on March the 10th without any unseemly conduct on your part in the courtroom. Here's a man's lawyer that told him, your father 30 years ago jumped bail. We're fixing to put him in jail. If you don't plead guilty, I, your lawyer, personally will see to it you get the electric chair. And all the way, we're trying to explain how y'all got all this money. So the government is going to say that your brother and you robbed banks. So he's going to jail if you don't go in and plead guilty tomorrow. The jury got this letter from his lawyer, promising him $165,000, but it was contingent on him pleading guilty. Thank God to the King family. Thank God to William Pepper that handled that case. Thank God to everybody out here and the many people that died. His brother was murdered. They said he drowned in the swimming pool. Dr. King's brother, because he was questioning King's death. A.D. They tried to kill Coretta in the church and missed her and killed Dr. King's mother and made like it was some little crazy lunatic guy that came down. And yet the King family kept on moving. Never born with millions of dollars. Never had the glamour that the Kennedy family had, and yet the Kennedy family haven't spent one nickel trying to find out what had happened to them Kennedys, including that funny little thing that went down with John last summer.
Thank you.
And so I say to you tonight, make no doubt about it, we are in one of the most evil, nasty, vicious, insane, ungodly, unethical systems that's ever existed in the history of the planet. And not only will they kill black folks, they'll kill white folks that look like they're going to show us in a certain light. How many of y'all in here saw the movie The Green Mile? Thank you. How many of y'all didn't like it?